The wind came first. It slid down off the high ridges and swept the valley bare, dragging dust and heat across the boards of the Miller Ranch gate where a lone woman stood, one hand clenched white around a worn canvas satchel. High Willow Valley stretched out behind her in brittle shades of gold and brown, all dry grass and scrub, and the far glint of a creek that hadn't run full in months. Grace Smith swallowed against the grit in her throat. Her boots were ghosted in trail dust, her plain dress travel-wrinkled, but her back stayed straight. She had not come all this way to turn around at the door. The latch clicked. The front door swung open, and a man filled its frame tall, shoulders broad from years of work, sun darkening the line of his jaw. His eyes, gray and steady, took her in the way a rancher sized up a storm cloud. "You ever worked with children before?" he asked, voice low. Grace drew a breath that felt like it scraped her lungs. "I can't have children," she said. Something flickered in his gaze. Then his mouth tipped into the smallest, surest smile she'd seen in years. "Good," he said. "I've got enough kids for both." High Willow Gisili stretched beneath the late summer sea like a grate, open wound carved by wind and time. The smell of burnt grass drifted along the ground, rising from earth that had seen more drought than mercy. Wind slid down from the western mountains, cold at its edges, smelling of stone and pine. It rattled loose nails on the barn shingles and sent a long, lonely creak through the wooden beams with every gust. A pair of horses shifted in the corral. Their bells jingled softly thin metallic notes that sounded almost mournful in the vast emptiness. This was Wyoming territory in 1887, a place where silence had weight, and every soul carried its own ghosts. Grace Smith stood at the edge of Miller Ranch, taking in the land with slow, careful breaths. The wind tugged at her skirt, but she steadied herself, back straight, hands clasped before her as if holding something fragile. Grief had been shaping her for years. It showed in the slope of her shoulders, the faint hollow beneath her eyes. It lived in the way she held her hands, fingers curled slightly inward, still trained in the instinctive posture of a maternity nurse. She had once worked in a small maternity infirmary, tending to laboring mothers, newborns gasping their first breaths, and frightened girls who needed a steady hand. Grace had loved that work. She had been good at it, gentle, patient, unshakable in a storm, until her own storm took everything. Thomas, her husband, had been clearing new land on the frontier edge when a rattlesnake struck. He died before help could reach him. Grace received the news on the same day she felt her own child go still inside her womb. The infirmary walls that once felt sacred suddenly suffocated her. Every cry of an infant cut too deep. Every tiny heartbeat reminded her of the one that never came. She could not bear to stay. But she could not bear to be without children either, teaching them quietly, gently. From a distance became the only way she knew how to breathe again. So she came here, to Willow Creek, because someone whispered about a ranch where children gathered like strays, yet somehow survived. A place run by a cowboy who took in the unwanted without expecting anything in return. A place full of heartbreak and hope in equal measure. The screen door creaked open, and Luke Miller stepped out of the barn. He moved with the solid weight of a man built from work and responsibility. Broad shoulders, a quiet, steady gait. His eyes storm gray, weathered, carried stories he did not bother to hide or polish. On his belt hung a worn hunting knife, the handle darkened with age, his sister's knife, the only thing she left behind when illness claimed her. Luke had never married, never let himself dream of a life for himself. Instead, he had spent years raising 3 nieces and nephews after their father abandoned them and their mother died. He fed them when food was scarce, held them when nights were cold, and learned slowly, painfully, that love sometimes meant giving up the life you imagined. Then came the other children. One by one, they appeared on his doorstep, a swaddled infant left by a widow who couldn't feed her. Another child abandoned when his mother died in a mining town outbreak. Another left anonymously, wrapped in a blanket with no note. Luke never asked why. He simply opened the door. The calluses on his palms, especially deep at the base of his fingers, were not only from ranch work, but from holding babies upright during long fevers, lifting tired toddlers onto horses, and carrying sleepy children to bed night after night. People in Willow Creek whispered that Luke Miller had more heart than he knew what to do with, but no one said it to his face. Grace watched him approach across the yard, dust rising around his boots. Something in his presence wrapped around her like the shadow of a tall tree, quiet, protective, weather-worn. Luke gestured towards the children scattered around the ranch. Nate, the eldest, worked with a hammer at the fence post, too serious for 10 years old, carrying responsibility like a second spine. Mira moved with gentle hesitation, whispering to chickens as if they were skittish patients she didn't want to frighten. Finn tore through the yard, wild and bright, barefoot in the dust, laughter bursting like small fireworks. Near the porch lay the 3 little ones, Hazel curled into herself, Winnie clapping at the sunbeams, Annie babbling at the wind. Each child carried a story of abandonment or loss. Yet each one breathed because Luke refused to let them disappear. Grace felt something shift in her chest, a soft ache, a longing, a recognition of wounds that mirrored her own. She reached out and placed her hand on the weathered wooden door frame of the ranch house. The wood was warm from the sun, rough beneath her palm, and in that small, quiet touch, something stirred as if this simple doorway were the threshold of a life she never expected, a life she thought she no longer deserved, a life waiting for her to choose it. Morning rose over High Willow Valley in a pale wash of gold, soft as breath against the mountains. The storm clouds of the night before were gone, leaving only thin streaks of lavender sky and the cool scent of wet dust. Somewhere near the barn, a horse stamped its hoof, shaking off sleep. The faint clang of a loose bell drifted through the stillness. Grace stepped out into the yard, gathering her shawl close. The wind carried a bite despite the summer, sliding through the valley like a reminder that nothing in this land was ever gentle for long. She found the children exactly where she expected to, scattered around the ranch like pieces of a story she hadn't learned to read yet. Nate was already working, of course he was. He stood at the fence line, jaw tight in concentration as he hammered a broken board back into place. His posture was stiff, too deliberate for a boy his age. Responsibility had made a home in his young body. Mira knelt among the chickens, whispering explanations only they could hear. She counted eggs aloud in a trembling little voice, then reset them in careful groups of 3. Finn, barefoot and dust-covered before breakfast, darted through the yard chasing a stray hen, laughter bursting from him like pure sunlight. Grace smiled softly. Children were the same everywhere, resilient, unpredictable, fragile in ways adults often forgot. She walked toward the cottonwood tree and drew an A in the dirt with a smooth stick. Just the gesture felt grounding, a piece of the old Grace resurfacing. Finn spotted her immediately. "What's that you're making?" he asked, plopping down in front of her with no hesitation at all. "A letter," Grace answered. "The beginning of many things." "Looks like a teepee that fell over," Finn declared. Mira appeared silently at his side, folding herself neatly onto the ground, her hands tucked into her lap. Nate stayed farther back, arms crossed, face unreadable. He watched her with a guardedness that didn't belong on a child, a look she recognized too well. Grace didn't call him closer. Instead, she drew another letter, letting the rhythm of the stroke speak for her. Behind her, 3 small bundles: Hazel, Winnie. Annie rested on the quilt. Hazel stirred once, whimpered, and Grace instinctively reached out to soothe her, 2 fingers brushing her cheek. She did it without thinking, but someone noticed. When she glanced back toward the porch, Luke stood there, arms folded loosely across his chest. His gaze was steady, too steady, watching her, as though she were something he hadn't expected to find in this place. Something he wasn't sure he deserved. The breeze blew strands of hair across Grace's face. She tucked them behind her ear, suddenly aware of the weight of his attention. Later that morning, near the pump, Grace scrubbed tin plates, letting the cool water run over her hands. The rhythm calmed her, simple, repetitive, familiar. She hummed softly, a tune she had learned during her nursing days, a lullaby meant to soothe frightened mothers more than their newborns. She sensed someone behind her and turned. Nate. His brow was furrowed, though he tried to hide it. When he spoke, the question came out sharp, almost accusing. "You gonna leave too?" Grace blinked. "Leave? They always do." He stared at the ground. "People come here saying they want to help, but they get tired, or scared. Then they leave. Luke don't say nothing when it happens. He just keeps going." Grace knelt to meet his eye level. She recognized that fear, the fear of being temporary in someone else's world. "Nate," she said softly, "I came here because I wanted a place to stay, a place where I could be useful, a place that might want me back." He looked up at her then, suspicion battling hope in his eyes. "And I'll stay," Grace continued, "as long as you all will have me." Nate swallowed hard and gave a single, stiff nod before turning away. But that small nod meant more than any spoken welcome. The sun slid lower across the valley as the day wore on. Golden light spilled across the yard as Luke sat on the porch repairing one of Finn's shirts. The fabric was small in his large hands, the stitches uneven but earnest. He pricked his thumb twice, swore under his breath once, but didn't stop. Grace approached quietly. "He likes that shirt," she said. Luke didn't glance up. "Wears it near every day." "You're doing a good job," she murmured. His hands paused, just for a heartbeat, then continued. She sat beside him on the porch step, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his shoulder, far enough to keep from crowding him. Luke finally spoke, voice low. "You work quiet. Kids like that." Grace folded her hands in her lap. "I had to learn quiet. Where I used to work, noise could break a fragile moment." Luke looked at her, then really looked, and she wondered if he understood that she wasn't only speaking of the infirmary. That night, after the children settled, Grace checked on Hazel again. The baby fussed softly, and Grace lifted her, rocking in slow circles, humming the lullaby she thought she had buried with her past. When she turned, Luke stood in the doorway. His face was shadowed by lamplight, but his eyes were full of something she hadn't seen before. Softness, recognition, a quiet, aching want neither of them dared name. "You're good with them," he said. Grace pressed her cheek to Hazel's hair. "They make it easy." Luke shook his head. No, not for everyone. Grace held his gaze. But for us? A breath. A pause. Maybe it is. The air shifted not with wind, but with understanding. Nothing dramatic happened. No declarations, no touch. Just two wounded hearts, acknowledging each other across a room full of sleeping children. And sometimes, that was more intimate than a kiss. Life at Miller Ranch unfolded in quiet layers, gentle repetitions of work, dust, sunlight, and laughter that slowly began to fill the hollow spaces inside Grace. By late morning, the heat shimmered above the corral. The air carried the scent of dry hay and sun-warmed wood, and somewhere in the distance, a lone hawk cried over the ridge. Grace found herself falling into the rhythm almost without trying. Under the cottonwood tree, she drew letters in the dirt for Finn and Mira. Her voice, once tight with caution, softened more each day. Finn sprawled on his stomach, kicking his heels in the dust. Mira copied each stroke with delicate precision, her brow knitting in focus. Nate hovered nearby, not participating, not ignoring, but watching as though measuring how deeply Grace intended to root herself into their lives. Hazel slept on the quilt beside them, her tiny breaths steady. Winnie gnawed on a wooden ring. Annie babbled at a butterfly that landed near her foot. Somewhere behind Grace, Luke hammered a loose hinge back onto the barn door. She could hear the rhythm of his work, the steady thud of the hammer, the rough scrape of wood, the occasional muttered word when something didn't sit quite right. Without turning, she knew he was watching her from time to time. No man had ever watched her this way, not even Thomas. This was different. Luke didn't stare. He observed, quietly, steadily, carefully, as if learning the shape of her presence without daring to reach for it. That afternoon, while Mira fed the chickens, Grace joined her. The girl moved slowly, cautiously, touching each hen with gentle fingers. "Did your mama teach you this?" Grace asked. Mira nodded. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. Before she went to heaven, Grace felt her throat tighten. She crouched beside the girl so they were eye level. "Mira, you take good care of them. Your mama would be proud." Mira's eyes glimmered. She blinked quickly and tucked a feather behind her ear. A quiet acceptance. A small piece of trust earned. Later, Grace found Finn struggling to button his shirt properly. His small hands worked the fabric with exaggerated confidence, but he kept mismatching the holes. "May I?" she asked gently. He grinned sheepishly and nodded. Grace fixed the buttons, smoothing his collar. When she finished, Finn wrapped his arms abruptly around her waist in a quick, fierce hug before darting off toward the horse trough. Grace stood still for a moment, her hands hovering where his arms had been. The warmth lingered. It startled her how badly she needed that. As the sun dipped lower, Grace stepped outside to find Luke sitting on the porch step, repairing a broken rein. His sleeves were rolled, exposing forearms dusted with golden hair, and the light caught in the curve of his jaw. His motions were sure, practiced, but something in his posture spoke of a man carrying more weight than he let on. Grace approached quietly. "You work even when the work is done," she said softly. Luke didn't look up. "There's always something that needs doing." Grace eased down beside him. "Do you ever rest?" He paused, not in thought, but because the question hit deeper than she intended. Then, with a quiet exhale, "Not sure I remember how." Grace let the silence settle between them, gentle, not heavy, the kind of silence that invited truth rather than buried it. "You've carried a lot." "Luke," she said finally. More than most men I've met. He swallowed, eyes fixed on the leather in his hands. That's just life out here. Not for everyone, she countered softly. He looked at her, then really looked. There was a flicker of vulnerability behind his steady gray eyes, as if someone had cracked open the door to a room he'd kept locked for years. "You're good with them," he murmured. "You ease this place." Grace smiled faintly. "I think this place eases me too." Something in Luke's expression shifted the faintest softening, like the settling of dust after a long storm. That night, Hazel woke crying. Grace scooped her up, rocking her gently as she hummed an old lullaby once sung to laboring mothers in the infirmary. The melody trembled at first, then steadied as Hazel's sobs quieted. When Grace turned, Luke stood in the doorway. The lamp behind him cast a warm glow around his silhouette, framing the broad set of his shoulders, the knife at his belt, the weariness he carried like a second spine. He looked at Grace not with longing, not with admiration, but with a reverence so quiet it almost broke her. "You settle her fast," he said. Grace brushed Hazel's hair back. "I've had practice." Luke's eyes flicked to the shadows where the other girls slept. "I'm glad you're here," he said so soft she almost thought she imagined it. Grace's breath caught. She didn't reply. But the truth sat between them like a lit lantern. He needed her. She needed them. And slowly, without meaning to, they were becoming something that resembled a family. No declarations, no promises. Just small moments of choosing each other. And sometimes, that was the beginning of everything. The storm announced itself long before the first drop of rain fell. All afternoon, the wind prowled the valley, shifting in unpredictable bursts. Horses tossed their heads restlessly, and the chickens huddled in the coop as if sensing something larger than weather approaching. Even the air felt wrong-heavy, metallic, thick with a tension that made Grace's skin tighten. By late evening, clouds rolled over High Willow Valley like dark, bruised waves. Thunder muttered somewhere over the distant peaks, low and uneasy. Grace stood by the window, Hazel nestled in her arms, when the first gust slammed into the ranch house, rattling the glass. The sudden force made Hazel whimper. Grace instinctively pressed the baby against her shoulder. A familiar fear, sharp, cold, intimate, shot up Grace's spine. Storms had always frightened her. Not because of the thunder, because storms brought memories. She felt again the helplessness of the night Thomas died. The way the world had blurred while she waited for news only to receive the worst. She felt the agony of lying in a clinic bed, knowing her child would never take its first breath. Storms took from her. Storms ended things. She swallowed, steadying her voice as she whispered to Hazel, "It's all right, sweetheart. I'm here." The rain began suddenly, no gentle drizzle, just a hard, violent sheet pounding against the roof. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the valley in white. Skeletal flashes. Grace shifted Hazel in her arms. Something felt wrong. The baby's skin was hotter than usual. Her breath short and uneven. Her body too still. Grace pressed her palm to Hazel's forehead. The heat beneath her touch was alarming, almost scalding. "No," Grace whispered, panic rising. "Not this. Not again." "Luke," she called. He came immediately, his boots thudding across the floorboards. When he saw Hazel small, trembling, flushed, his face drained of color. "What's happening?" "Her fever's spiking," Grace said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "She's losing strength." Another flash of lightning lit the room, and Hazel's tiny body shuddered with a weak cry. Grace's throat tightened. This was the kind of fever that took children in hours. She had seen it before, too many times. She had held babies through it. She had lost some. She couldn't lose Hazel. Not this child, not in her arms. Luke saw the terror behind her eyes. His own jaw set, instinct kicking in. "What do you need?" he asked. Grace clutched Hazel closer, her hands trembling now with the force of memories clawing their way back. "I need Dr. Malcolm Pierce," she said. "My mentor, the best healer in Willow Creek. He'll know what to do." The wind howled then, shaking the entire house. Rain hammered the roof in relentless waves. Luke didn't flinch. "Where is he?" "At the infirmary," Grace said breathlessly. "But Luke, you must tell him exactly what's wrong. High fever, shallow breaths, weakening reflexes. He has to bring the right medicines." "I can't leave Hazel. And I can't." Her voice broke. "I can't lose another child in a storm." The confession tore out of her before she could stop it. It hung between them raw, painful, honest. Something in Luke's face softened. He didn't speak condolences. He didn't ask questions. He just stepped closer, steady, grounding, and placed his hand over hers for a single, anchoring moment. "I'll bring him back," he said. Then he grabbed his coat, fastened the hunting knife at his belt, and lifted the lantern. Grace wanted to tell him to wait for a break in the storm, to think of himself, to be careful. But Hazel stirred weakly in her arms, whimpering in a way that broke her open. And Luke saw the decision in Grace's eyes, saw her desperate hope hanging by a thread. He nodded once. "Keep her breathing," he murmured. Then he stepped outside, swallowed instantly by darkness and rain. Grace fought for Hazel's life with every skill she had left. She cooled the fever with wet cloths, rocked her when the tremors came, kept her upright when her breathing hitched. Her own tears fell onto Hazel's hair, mixing with sweat and storm-damp air. Nate hovered near the door, fists clenched. Mira cried silently in the corner. Finn held Grace's skirt in shaking hands. "Stay with me," Grace whispered fiercely into Hazel's hair. "Don't leave me, not tonight." The world outside roared thunder, wind, rain, endless noise, but inside, everything narrowed to one tiny heartbeat. And one promise: Luke would return. He would. Hours later, when Grace was certain she couldn't hold Hazel upright any longer, hoofbeats broke through the storm. Faint, then louder, then unmistakable. Grace ran to the door just as Luke stumbled inside. Drenched, bruised, shivering violently, mud streaked his face, and one sleeve was torn from a branch. But he was alive, and behind him Dr. Malcolm Pierce, soaked to the bone, carrying his medical bag. "Where is she?" he demanded, already stepping forward. Grace placed Hazel in his arms with a sob of relief. And the storm, violent, merciless, all-consuming, finally felt small, very small, by dawn. The storm had finally lost its rage. The wind slowed to a long, weary sigh, rattling the wet leaves of the cottonwoods as if apologizing for what it had done. Pale gold seeped into the valley, stretching over the soaked earth where puddles shimmered like pieces of fallen sky. Inside the house, the air felt still fragile, reverent, as though the walls themselves understood they had witnessed something sacred. Hazel lay sleeping in her crib, her breath steady and soft, her fever broken. The rise and fall of her tiny chest was the most beautiful rhythm Grace had ever seen. Grace sat beside her in a small wooden chair, exhaustion settling onto her shoulders like a blanket. Her fingers trembled as they brushed Hazel's cheek, not with fear this time, but with overwhelming relief. Dr. Malcolm Pierce closed his medicine bag, exhaled, and pushed a damp curl away from his forehead. He looked older than Grace remembered, years of frontier medicine etched into the lines around his eyes. "You acted fast," he said gently. Grace shook her head, tears already stinging her eyes. "But I couldn't stop her fever. I couldn't." Pierce stepped closer and rested a warm, reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Grace," he said softly, "you saved this child's life." Her breath broke. She looked at him, uncomprehending. "You recognized the danger early. You kept her breathing. You kept her warm. You kept her here." His voice softened further, with that old mentor's tenderness she had almost forgotten. "That's everything I taught you, everything you were born to do." Grace covered her mouth, shoulders trembling as tears she had held back for years finally spilled, tears for Hazel, for the nights in the infirmary, for the child she lost, for the woman she had been forced to become. "I thought," she whispered, voice cracking, "I thought I couldn't do this anymore, that I didn't deserve to." Pierce bent a little, lowering himself to her eye level. "You are not broken," he said. "You are scarred, and scars don't make you less, they make you more." Grace let out a long, shaking breath as her grief unfurled, no longer strangling her from the inside. Pierce squeezed her shoulder once more, then stepped back. His gaze shifted toward the doorway. Luke stood there, swaying slightly, drenched clothes plastered to his frame, face pale with exhaustion, with cold, with the weight of what he had done. He looked like a man who had carried his family through the night on his back and wasn't sure whether he had made it until he saw Hazel breathing. Pierce crossed the room to him. "You," he said quietly, "are a good man, Luke Miller." Luke stiffened, uncomfortable under praise. "I just rode." "No." Pierce shook his head. "You rode through a storm that would have turned most men back. You didn't hesitate. You didn't think of yourself." He held Luke's gaze. "You acted like a father." Luke swallowed, throat tight. "I couldn't let her die. Any of them. They're all I've got." Pierce rested a hand on Luke's shoulder, voice lowering to a near whisper. "Then hear this, Luke, and hear it well. Don't let Grace slip away. Men like you, men who love this deeply, this quietly, you don't get many chances. She steadies this house. She steadies you." Luke blinked slowly, as though the words struck something buried and tender inside him. When Pierce left to retrieve his horse, the house fell into a hush again. Grace finally rose from the crib, swaying a little. Luke stepped forward instinctively. "You need rest," he murmured, but Grace shook her head, her eyes still wet, still shining, lifted to meet his. "You came back," she whispered. Luke looked away, jaw tightening with the effort to remain composed. "I weren't going to leave you alone with that storm." Grace took a step closer. Luke's breath hitched. "I meant," she said softly, "you could have died." His voice came low, rough. "I wasn't thinking about dying. What were you thinking?" He lifted his gaze to her slowly, painfully, honestly. "I was thinking about you," he said, "and Hazel, and the others, and how I couldn't." His voice broke for the first time. "I couldn't lose either of you." Grace pressed a trembling hand to her chest. Luke took a breath that sounded like he'd been holding it since the storm began. "I ain't good with words," he murmured, "but I know this. When I was out there, all I could think was, get back to you, get back home, home." The word hung between them, soft, unclaimed, waiting. Grace stepped closer until only inches separated them. Luke didn't move, didn't breathe. Her voice was barely a whisper. You matter to me. Luke. He let out a shaky breath, something wounded and relieved unraveling inside him. And you matter to me. Grace. For a long moment, they stood in the soft half-light of dawn, two souls marked by loss, held together by the weight of what they almost lost, and what they were just beginning to realize they had found. Not love, not yet, but the unmistakable beginning of it. The kind that grows quietly, like grass after rain, determined, unstoppable, rooting itself deep into the soil of shared survival. And when Hazel stirred softly in her crib, both Grace and Luke turned toward the sound together instinctively, naturally like two halves of the same life. The storm left High Willow Valley washed clean. Hazel's fever broke by morning, and when she opened her eyes, the entire house seemed to exhale. Mira cried quietly against Grace's skirt. Finn whooped so loudly he scared the hens, and Nate let out a long breath he'd been holding since the night before. Grace touched Hazel's cheek with a trembling hand. This time, the tears that rose were not of fear, but gratitude. And Luke, standing in the doorway, watched her with a softness that no longer hid behind distance. Something between them had changed, not spoken aloud, not fully understood, but undeniably real. In the days that followed, the ranch settled into a new rhythm. Grace taught letters under the cottonwood. Luke repaired saddles nearby. Mira shadowed Grace like a younger sister. Finn insisted on helping Luke with chores he was far too small for. And Hazel slept most peacefully in Grace's arms. Luke found excuses to be near her, fixing a hinge while she braided Mira's hair, checking the water pump while she washed tin plates. He did not rush. He did not speak more than usual, but his presence beside her grew steady, warm, familiar. One evening, the valley glowing gold, Luke joined Grace at the fence. "You ease this house," he said quietly. She looked at him, startled by the gentleness in his voice. "And you," she whispered, "brought me back to life." He took her hand hesitantly, carefully, and when she didn't pull away, something eased in him, as if a lifelong knot had finally loosened. Spring brought the wedding simple, tender, perfect. Under the cottonwood tree, Luke wore his best vest, Grace a cream dress Mira helped stitch. The children stood close, Nate steady and proud, Mira holding flowers, Finn nearly losing the rings twice. Hazel clapped through the entire ceremony. When the preacher asked Luke for his vow, he simply said, "I'll make sure she always knows she's wanted here." Grace's answering smile was all the vow she needed. Years passed, and Miller Ranch became a refuge for abandoned children from every corner of the valley. Grace taught them, Luke protected them. Together, they built a home that grew not through blood, but through every small act of love. People began calling it the home at High Willow. And one quiet evening, long after the storm that changed everything, Grace paused at the ranch doorway, her hand resting on the same wooden frame she had touched on her first day. Only now, the gesture felt different. She wasn't touching the threshold of an uncertain life, but the doorway of a home she had helped create. Luke stepped beside her. Hazel, now older, leaned against her hip. Grace smiled softly. "Home," she whispered. And with Luke at her side and the children's laughter inside, she stepped forward into the life she had finally allowed herself to claim.